By 1988, RJR Nabisco was a massive corporate empire. They owned the brands that sat in nearly every American pantry: Oreos, Ritz Crackers, Del Monte, and some of the biggest names in tobacco, including Winston and Salem. The tobacco division in particular was an absolute financial juggernaut. Because cigarettes were incredibly cheap to make and commanded huge profit margins, this single division churned out $1 billion in free cash flow every single year. CEO Ross Johnson knew exactly how to spend that cash. He was a natural salesman who loved the high life, filling the company's payroll with expensive celebrity consultants and operating an entire fleet of corporate jets known as the RJR Air Force. Yet, there was a problem Johnson couldn't solve with his expense account. Despite those massive profits, Wall Street priced RJR Nabisco stock around $50 a share, weighed down by investor fears over tobacco liability lawsuits. Johnson watched his peer companies flying high in the market, and he was determined to force his own stock price up. This chart shows his strategy, a leveraged buyout, or LBO. Instead of trying to please Wall Street, Johnson and his executives would borrow billions of dollars, buy all the outstanding public shares at $75 each, and take the entire company private. Once they owned it, they would sell off some food divisions to pay down the debt and keep the massive tobacco profits for themselves. Johnson assumed this would be a quiet inside job. He had carefully cultivated relationships with his board of directors over the years, handing out lucrative consulting contracts and favors. He fully expected them to approve his $75 buyout with zero public fuss. But he misunderstood corporate law. The board's outside legal counsel pointed out that under Delaware law, directors have a strict fiduciary duty to the shareholders. If management was offering to buy the company, the board had to disclose it. They forced Johnson to issue a press release. That single press release blew Johnson's cover completely. By publicly announcing a buyout offer, the board had effectively put RJR Nabisco in play. It was a flashing neon sign to every corporate raider and investment bank in the country that a company with $1 billion cash flow was up for sale. One of the men reading that press release was Henry Kravis, the head of Kohlberg Kravis Roberts and the undisputed king of the leveraged buyout industry. Kravis felt slighted. He had actually discussed a buyout with Johnson a year earlier, only to be cut out of this new deal. Driven by a need to protect his dominance on Wall Street, Kravis immediately launched his own hostile tender offer for $90 a share. Suddenly facing a bidding war, Johnson's team scrambled to lock down their financing. In the process, details of the management agreement between Johnson and his investment bankers began circulating on Wall Street. This chart illustrates the terms of that secret contract. Johnson and his executives were putting up exactly $0 of their own capital. In exchange, they demanded 20% of all future profits and structured an additional $52.5 million in golden parachutes for themselves. When those numbers leaked to the press, the public backlash was immediate and brutal. Newspapers ran cartoons of RJR Nabisco employees being shredded like cereal. The board of directors, flooded with hate mail, turned completely against Johnson, furious that he had placed them at the center of a national scandal. With the board treating Johnson as a hostile bidder rather than a trusted CEO, the quiet management buyout fractured into a highly public, cutthroat auction. This graph tracks the escalation. Bidding started at a $75 floor, broke $90 as factions outbid each other, and then crossed $100 a share. The $20 billion price tag shocked investment bankers, pushing the limits of the global banking system. At this altitude, the bids were no longer based on the actual math of selling cookies and cigarettes. The valuation was being driven entirely by psychological warfare, the prospect of hundreds of millions in advisory fees, and the sheer refusal of Wall Street's biggest egos to lose the deal of the decade. On November 30th, the exhausted RJR Nabisco board of directors gathered to review the final offers. They had to pick a winner. This diagram shows the final choice. Johnson offered $112 a share. Kravis bid $109. Though legally required to maximize shareholder value, directors were disgusted by Johnson's greed, as his bid relied on gutting the company to cover debts. The board made an incredibly rare move. They rejected the higher bid and handed the company to Henry Kravis. They reasoned that Kravis's $109 offer was actually safer. It required selling off fewer divisions, offered a larger ongoing equity stake for the current shareholders, and provided stronger protections for the thousands of employees Johnson had been willing to sacrifice. Executing the buyout required a financial operation unlike anything seen before. In a matter of hours, commercial banks transferred nearly $19 billion in cash across the global banking system. Because the Federal Reserve Network couldn't process wires over $1 billion at once, the money had to be routed in massive chunks. The concentrated movement of capital was so immense that it caused a visible, temporary spike in the official United States money supply statistics. The buyout of RJR Nabisco marked the absolute peak of 1980s corporate excess. It terrified Washington, triggered intense political hearings on the dangers of corporate debt, and temporarily cooled the entire leveraged buyout industry. Ross Johnson had started the auction to secure a payout he didn't need and a level of control he already enjoyed. But his arrogance forced the company into the open market and ultimately cost him the very empire he had tried to conquer.